Dublin. The year is 1350. In the space of 8 months, the Black Death killed more than 1/3 of the city's entire population. The bodies came so fast that graveyards ran out of consecrated ground, and the dead were buried in mass pits outside the city walls. Priests refused last rites because they were afraid to enter infected houses. Mothers abandoned their own children in the street. A chronicler writing from a monastery just outside Dublin recorded that he was not certain he would live to finish the sentence he was writing, and that if a stranger found the manuscript, he asked them to complete what he had left unfinished. He did not finish it. No one completed it for him. But in the oldest part of Dublin, in a cluster of streets that ran along the western edge of the city close to the river, the plague did not come. Not a single recorded death. Not one household shuddered in mourning. Not one body carried to the pits. While the city died around it, this 1/4 of perhaps 250 souls remained alive, remained healthy, and remained, most strangely of all, completely silent about why. They knew why. They had always known, and they had agreed, every man, woman, and working soul among them, never to tell anyone outside the quarter what they knew. Because the knowledge itself, they believed, was the thing that would destroy them if it left the quarter's boundaries. Not the plague, the knowledge. This is the story of what they knew and what it cost them to keep it. Dublin in 1350 is a city of approximately 8,000 people, though that number will lose meaning within a year of the plague's arrival. It is an Anglo-Norman city built on an older Irish settlement, walled in gray stone, pressed between a river and a bay, rain-soaked for 300 days of every year. Its streets are narrow, and its buildings are close, and its population is dense in the way that medieval cities are dense. People and animals sharing the same spaces, waste in the gutters, wells close to the cesspits, everything touching everything else in the intimate proximity that makes a city a perfect engine for the transmission of disease. The plague arrives in the summer of 1348 by ship from Bristol. Within a fortnight of the first death in the Harbour District, the infection has spread into every ward of the city. The mechanism of its spread is not understood by anyone in Dublin in 1348. Not the physicians, not the clergy, not the city's aldermen. The prevailing explanations involve corrupted air, divine punishment, the alignment of celestial bodies, and the malign influence of certain categories of people who are blamed and persecuted as the dying accelerates. None of these explanations are correct. None of them help. What the inhabitants of the Western Quarter know, and what they have known for 11 years before the plague arrives, has nothing to do with celestial bodies or corrupted air or divine punishment. It has to do with water. Specifically, it has to do with a well. The Western Quarter's well is old, older than the Norman walls, older than the Viking settlement that preceded them, old enough that no one in 1350 can say with certainty who dug it or when. What is known within the quarter is that the well's water is different from the water of the city's other wells. Not in taste. It tastes the same, cool and faintly mineral in the way of Dublin water generally. Not in smell. Not in appearance. The difference is in what the water does, or more precisely, in what it prevents. The man who first understood this was a tanner working in the quarter in 1339. He was not a physician, not a scholar, not any kind of educated man in any formal sense. He was a man who worked with hides and chemicals and observed things carefully because his livelihood depended on careful observation. What he observed, over the course of a summer in which 2 other wells in the adjacent streets were producing water that made people ill, a different illness, a summer flux that killed several people in the surrounding streets, but no one in the quarter, was that the people who drank from his quarter's well did not get sick. People from outside the quarter who came to drink from it did not get sick either. People from inside the quarter who had been traveling and drinking from other sources came back and within days were sick and recovered when they returned to the quarter's water. He told one person, a woman who had been his neighbor for 20 years and who he trusted because she had given him no reason not to. She told him he was right, that she had noticed the same thing, that she had been keeping a private count in her head for 3 years, and the pattern was exactly as he described. They agreed not to tell anyone outside the quarter because they understood, with the practical intelligence of working people, that the response from the city's authorities and physicians would not be gratitude. It would be suspicion. It would be the kind of attention that working people in medieval cities do not survive intact. They told the quarter. Quietly, carefully, over the course of a winter, they told everyone who lived within its boundaries what they had observed and what they believed it meant. Not the mechanism. They did not know the mechanism. No one in 1339 in the entire world knew the mechanism. But the practical conclusion: drink from this well, do not drink from the others, and do not tell anyone outside the quarter what you are doing or why. 250 people kept this secret for 11 years. When the plague came to Dublin in 1348, the quarter did what it had been doing for 11 years. It drank from its well. It did not drink from other sources. And when the city began to die around it, it survived. The discipline required to maintain this survival was extraordinary, and is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the quarter's story. It was not simply a matter of drinking clean water. It was a matter of maintaining every appearance of normality while the city collapsed. The quarter's inhabitants continued to trade in the city's markets, continued to attend church services when they still occurred, continued to conduct the business of ordinary life in a dying city, because stopping would have drawn exactly the kind of attention that the tanner and his neighbor had warned against 11 years earlier. The moment the quarter visibly separated itself from the dying city's experience, the city's remaining authorities would want to know why. And knowing why, they would take the well. They would take the knowledge. They would turn it into something official and controlled, and the quarter would lose the one thing protecting it. So they acted as though they too were afraid. They boarded windows when the neighbors boarded theirs. They brought out their dead, the dead from age, from accidents, from ordinary illness, with the same public grief as everyone else. They accepted the condolences of surviving neighbors for losses that were not plague losses. They maintained the performance of shared catastrophe while privately experiencing something entirely different. The moral weight of this performance is something the quarter's people never fully resolved among themselves. Several of them, by accounts that survived in fragments, refused to enter the church when the priest prayed for an end to the pestilence, because they felt they could not pray for something they were not experiencing in good conscience. They stood outside in the rain instead, which the surviving priest took as an excess of grief and recorded as evidence of particular piety. The secret held for the duration of the first wave. It held through the second wave in 1360, when the plague returned and the quarter again lost no one, while the city's other wards suffered losses that reduced Dublin's population to perhaps a third of what it had been a generation earlier. It began to unravel not through betrayal, but through the observation of an outsider sharp enough to notice what the quarter was not doing. A Franciscan friar who had been ministering to the dying throughout the worst years of the pestilence, and who had survived, more through constitution than any protection he understood, began to notice, in the second wave, that his calls to the western quarter to administer last rites were entirely different in character from his calls to the rest of the city. He was called to the quarter for the deaths of old people, for accidents, for a woman who died in childbirth, never for plague. He was a careful man, and a private one, and he did not raise an alarm. He simply knocked on a door in the western quarter one evening in 1362 and asked the woman who answered it a single question. He told her that he was not there in any official capacity, that he had no authority over her answer, and that his interest was not in punishment or in seizure or in any consequence for the quarter. His interest, he said, was in understanding, because he had spent 14 years watching people die of something he could not explain, and the Western Quarter was the only place in Dublin where people were not dying, and he wanted to understand why. Not in order to use the knowledge against anyone, but in order to give it to the dying. The woman looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would need to speak with several people before she could answer, and asked him to come back in 3 days. When he came back, the tanner was still alive, 71 years old, which was extraordinary in any era, and particularly in this one, and he was the one who opened the door. He brought the friar inside. He told him about the well. He told him about the 11 years of observation before the plague. He told him what the quarter had done to survive. And he told him that he was telling him now because he was old, and he would not live much longer, and the thought of the knowledge dying with him when it might save other people was worse than any punishment the authorities might inflict. The friar spent 3 weeks at the well. He collected water from it and from 12 other wells across Dublin. He conducted tests that were primitive by any scientific standard, but systematic in their logic, giving the water to animals, observing the results, keeping notes in a personal record that he kept hidden and that was not part of any official Franciscan documentation. His conclusions matched the quarter's conclusions with enough precision that he was as certain as a man of his era could be that the quarter was right. He spent the remainder of his life trying to convince the city's authorities that water quality was related to disease. He was not believed, because the theory contradicted everything the medical and theological establishments of 14th century Ireland accepted as true. His notes survived in a monastery archive where they were catalogued as a curiosity, filed incorrectly under a heading relating to water engineering, and not read by anyone who understood their significance for nearly 500 years. The Western Quarter continued to drink from its well. The knowledge stayed inside its boundaries for another generation, until the city's expansion and the redevelopment of its oldest districts finally dismantled the quarter's physical coherence, and its people dispersed into the broader fabric of Dublin's life, carrying with them a private understanding of something that the rest of the world would not officially confirm for another 5 centuries. The well itself was filled in during a street-widening project in the 1500s. No record of its location was kept. It is somewhere beneath the stones of modern Dublin, still cold, still clean, still carrying the water that kept 250 people alive in the years when a third of Europe was dying. The city walks over it every day and does not know it is there. Some things survive by becoming invisible. The Western Quarter learned that lesson first, and it learned it completely.